Hello, everyone. My name is Eyob Balcha Gebremariam, and I'm presenting a working paper entitled "A Review of Decolonial Epistemologies of Knowledge Production." Questions that I would like to address in this presentation are: what kinds of epistemic inquiries do decolonial perspectives offer to knowledge production? And how can we translate this decolonial epistemic perspective into research endeavors? And my intention was to cover at least the developed studies, advanced studies, and education in particular, but I will primarily focus on the review of the literature. The starting point, before I go to there, these are the three decolonial perspectives that I would like to focus on: the colonial matrix of power, primarily proposed by Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh; the empire framework by Savile Nvolo Gatsheni, and the sociology of absence by the Boaventura de Sousa Santos. The starting point with this understanding decolonial perspective is, for me, is to make a distinction between this kind of interrelated but distinctive terms: colonization, colonialism, and coloniality. What I mean by colonization, this is what I learned from the literature, is a very time and territory bounded exercise of domination and power. And you have a beginning and an end. For instance, in the African context, we may think about the 1883 or 84 Berlin Conference to the 1960s, nearly like an 8-decade period of colonization, physical presence of foreign powers. But colonialism is a continuity of those kinds of economic, political, socio-cultural, epistemological, psychological, military relations that were founded during particularly that period of colonization. So colonialism denotes, as Rolando Torres argues, colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of the nation or people rests on the power of another nation. You will have an extended power that would definitely transcend that particular time and physically, geographically limited exercise of power. Whereas coloniality is, of course, very much related to colonialism. It's also somehow the extent to which that the culture, even the epistemological orientation of peoples and the intersubjective relations and knowledge productions remains very much under the dominance of a particular socio-historically located epistemic framework. So coloniality also transcends and survives colonialism. I wouldn't believe that colonialism can end in any shape or form, even more so for coloniality. So making these distinctions, I think, a very good starting point to understand decolonial epistemologies. When we come to the colonial matrix of power, the primary point of departure for the argument is identifying modernity and coloniality as two sides of the same coin. They say that we cannot disassociate modernity from coloniality. Modernity is this Eurocentric socio-historical and political process that primarily started starting from the Enlightenment period, whereas, and of course, you can talk about modernization, enlightenment, progress, civilization, and all development in the last 7 decades, and all the positive things associated with it. Whereas coloniality is about the rereading of those social historical processes from the perspective of the non-European societies that have encountered various forms that encountered the negative aspects of all these rosy images of progress, development, and civilization. So you talk about the genocide, the subjugation, and the linguicide, the epistemicide, exploitation, slave trade, and everything that associated with the histories of societies in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, or in Australia. So they say that these are primarily intertwined and we cannot disassociate them. So decoloniality is making some kind of a deliberate effort of delinking from a knowledge framework that presents only one side of modernity by delinking, by objectively, by rejecting that kind of orientation, which recognizes only a single part of the modernist history. And they push for epistemic disobedience with this regard. Sabelo Ngolo-Gatshenyi proposes this empire framework, 3 forms of empire and 3 forms of decolonization. And I wouldn't talk about the political decolonization, but it's primarily second and the third one, the commercial, military, and territorial empire, which requires economic decolonization, and the metaphysical empire, which requires epistemic decolonization. A good example for the commercial, military, and territorial empire is probably what we all know of the Commonwealth that puts the UK or Britain at the center of shaping the social, cultural, economic, and political dynamics of its previous colonial territories, and also the Franc zone that France dominated. Literally at this time, like 15 African countries in Central and West Africa, including Comoros, their currency is directly dominated and somehow controlled by French treasury. And you would see how poverty sustained in these countries, how exploitation and subjugation remained in these countries. 5 of these countries belong in the top, in the bottom 10 of the Human Development Index, including the 3 poorest countries in this world: Chad, Central African Republic, and Niger. And you wouldn't hear this featuring in the mainstream, in the foreground of studies, particularly in development studies. So the empire framework primarily focused on then pushing for primarily, not only economic decolonization, but also epistemic decolonization. The third aspect, the third epistemological orientation that I will focus on is the sociology of absence, which argues that what doesn't exist is actively produced as non-existent. And Santos provides us with 5 monocultures in which that non-existence is produced, where knowledge is considered singular. So it's only European history. Knowledge that emanates from European history is considered the hegemonic one, the important one, whereas he proposes what we need to look for is primarily ecology of knowledge in terms of time. European history considered as the starting and the end of world history, but he talks about temporalities and multiple ways of recognition, transcale, and productivities to go beyond the dominant narrative of capitalist productivity. The key message that I would like to convey in this presentation is that these 3 decolonial frameworks of inquiry have their own different epistemic orientation. The colonial metrics of power focus on epistemic disobedience. We need to delink our epistemic location from this very modernist and Eurocentric perspective that portrays only single narrative of modernity, progress, civilization, just the positive aspect. It wouldn't allow us to understand, to examine the underbelly of this progress and development, because it wouldn't recognize the genocide, the linguicide, the epistemicide that happened along with this modernist exercise of power. And the empire framework, it pushed for epistemic freedom, primarily focusing on the metaphysical empire, how Europe history became the dominant one, and where other countries' social, historical, and political histories and encounters are considered less relevant. And it talks about epistemic decolonization. Sociology of absence talks about epistemic imagination. It's only once we open the box that we are trapped into where hegemonic knowledge framework allows us to think only in one direction. Unless we open ourselves to have more epistemic imagination, we wouldn't be able to understand the ecologies that would allow us to learn from each other and to put for more of a just social relation. Actually, Santos argues that there wouldn't be social justice without cognitive justice, without understanding the epistemic relevance of societies that have considered to play a marginal role in the world economic and political processes. I was considering spending more time in taking examples from some of the well-known authors like Omar Kotari and Paeli, and especially Pigott and Silla presented us a very compelling story about how the Frank zone dominates the socioeconomic and political history of African countries, especially also in education. We have the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, how language used to colonize people's mind, and Obamba and Kiriga Delegates' work on the Ethiopian education system. So my contribution is how we can use these colonial perspectives to demand more openness in understanding just transitions or just social systems or justice in general. How can we remain in pursuit of justice if we don't recognize such kinds of epistemic injustice that has happened across the world over the past few decades or centuries? Thank you.